Hi, Dr. Piper. Welcome to the Genetic Genius. I am so excited to have you as a guest today.
Hi, Dr. Lulu. Thank you so much for having me. I am excited to join you.
Yay, welcome. So we're going to be diving deep into the aspect of the brain today. And I'd love for you to give a little bit about your background, how you got started and what you're doing, your passion, your place on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did not start out in health and wellness. I had big dreams. I was going to be a fashion designer, but my son got sick at age 6 and he was diagnosed with a transient neurological tic. And after lots of different approaches and medications and a gazillion doctor visits, I decided that I would go back to school and relearn everything I thought I knew about health and wellness. And so now here I am 4 years later, and I am passionate about working with families just like mine. So I help scared, frustrated, overwhelmed parents get access to the tools and education they need to start reducing their child's tic disorder symptoms naturally.
I love that, Piper. And it's so important. We have so many family members that need help. And it's having someone like you in our back pocket and resource is so important. So I hope everyone that's needing and listening out there you're going to have some amazing tips from Piper today about how to help with tic disorders and other aspects of the brain. So let's get started. I'd like for you to just lay that foundation for what a tic disorder is. Can you explain like a little bit about it? And is it connected to ADHD and how it's different?
Yeah, so tic disorders are a movement disorder. Tic disorders are usually diagnosed before you are diagnosed with Tourette's, but it's a movement disorder that includes either a vocal or a motor tic. So some children might clear their throat or say a word repeatedly, where other children might jerk their neck or blink their eyes or clap their hands. A complex tic would be if they are doing both of those things. And then once they've done both of those things together, a complex tic for a year or more, then many of these children are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. But it's a movement disorder. And yes, I believe that tic disorders, ADHD, sensory processing, OCD, all of the letter diagnoses are absolutely connected. Anxiety is a big part of it as well. And the way I approach it is definitely different than it's being approached right now in conventional areas.
Yeah, and having some alternative health methods or approaches is so key, so important because I feel like a lot of the parents they're like lost about what to do because there's not a lot of resources when they see a typical allopathic MD. They're just okay, now what?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's really a big part. A big part of it when parents come to me, they are lost, they are scared, they are frustrated, and they really don't know how to help their child. And you feel just helpless and deflated.
Yeah, not a great feeling to be in when you're a parent for sure.
No.
Yeah. So when the tic disorders that start to show up in the body, is that usually at a specific age range or does it really vary a lot?
So when you look at the typical research, it says that tics start to show up around age 8. I find that's very contradictory to what I see with my clients. Most clients start experiencing different types of tic symptoms at around age 3 or 4.
Mm.
Most of them kind of start with some eye blinking. You go to the doctor, they're like, oh, it's allergies, take some Zyrtec. But now, especially me, I can look back and say, okay, that's really when it started for us. And by
Mhm.
age 6, it was like an explosion.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it's great. Sounds like it's be great to know those early signs for your like looking for things. And do you have that kind of resource on your website, like a little, I don't know, some kind of handout or something that says signs or a blog? I know you have a great blog about like signs to look for, early signs, so to speak.
Yeah, we have a great blog on the website where I think there's about 34 or 35 different blogs at this point talking about how do you talk to your child's teacher about tics? What are some of those early signs? What is a tic? And so all of those are over there on my blog that people can absolutely read more.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, we'll make sure we put that in the show notes so we're ready to find. Okay, so you're working with a family, children and parents together. What are some of those root causes that you see that from that natural perspective that are related to tic disorders?
Tics are so multi-layered. And I say tic disorder symptoms. So the actual
Right.
tic is like a boil over. So
Mm,
when you're in the kitchen and you have a pot of boiling water and you're across the kitchen, you can't see it boiling. It's there, it's boiling, but you can't see it. And so If by chance that water boils and it boils over, you can see it from across the kitchen. And it's very much the same way with a tick. They have these triggering events. They have things going on inside their body that we can't see. It's boiling, it's there. And then the tick, we start these symptoms. It's this boil over symptom. And I find that things like food sensitivities, gut microbiome, underlying infection, intestinal permeability play a huge role, because we know gut brain are connected. And then another huge piece of how I work with clients is looking at genetics. It was an absolute game changer for my family. And it is a key piece of how I help my clients. We need a road.
Yeah, you got to have that genetic blueprint. That's great, Piper. I love that. And we'll dive deep into kind of those specific things as we talk more, because I think that's the juicy tidbits of how we can help our children and our families.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're thinking that let's talk about the gut, because that's such an important one. And I love that gut brain connection that you mentioned. So how do you decide, or what are your tools? Like say someone comes in and you're thinking like, okay, there's some tick disorders going on, some tick symptoms. And what's that process where you're like, okay, is it connected to the gut? Do you do some testing? Do you do some like food testing to see if there's a food sensitivity? Could you walk us through what that process looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a huge health history. I want to know what's happened since the day your child was born.
That's right.
Because all of those things can absolutely be connected. But I really feel like the most important thing for parents that are their children struggling with tics or any of these other diagnoses is to test, don't guess. And so
Right.
I love some good lab data, and really looking at a stool pathogen test, food sensitivities, those kinds of things really give us some clues as to what is really going on in your child's body. And I feel like there's not a one size fits all approach. What might be good for my child may not be good for your child.
Exactly.
And when we have that data, then we know what direction to move in.
Yeah, that's so key, because it's true. We're all individualized. We each have our own individual microbiome, like you mentioned. And let's talk a little bit about pathogens, because I know you mentioned that word too. Can you tell us what would be something that you would see on some of those lab results that you would be like, oh yeah, this pathogen might be triggering some of the symptoms?
Yeah, there's several of them. So I will say that a lot of the kids I work with, at some point, they have done a lot of antibiotics. When that happens, we do see a lot of overgrowth of things like C. diff, which can definitely cause a lot of these OCD symptoms. But looking at things like strep or staph or even H. pylori, they can have a big impact on how your child is digesting food, how they are absorbing nutrients, and really that integrity of the gut as a whole. If you have that underlying infection going on, it really may be damaging to their gut in general.
Great. And okay, so let's say there's a gut problem, but how does that reconnect back to the brain? I think we jumped ahead of the horse there, or the cart.
Yeah, absolutely. Your gut and your brain are connected through the vagus nerve. But another thing that's really interesting about this connection is that if you have some intestinal permeability, those pathogens or medications or undigested food particles are getting into your bloodstream, and your immune system is high alert. What is that? That does not belong there. And that actually can impact our brain. So we have specialized immune cells in our brain, microglial cells. And what happens that, especially kids with tic disorders, is that maybe they've got some gut issues. The immune system is turned on, and then those microglial cells in the brain get activated. And when that happens, we release glutamate. We have this glutamate storm. Glutamate, very excitatory to the brain. And then we see these kids with a lot of symptoms. We're looking at, yes, your gut brain are connected, but what else is happening between the gut, the immune system, and the brain?
Oh, so important. So when someone comes with they have leaky gut or that permeability, how is that affecting their whole body's like inflammatory response?
I love to connect it to the genetics. So I look at your on and off switches for inflammation. And some kids, some adults, we are going to be predisposed to this, what I call lighter fluid effect. Our genes are going to be turned on, and our immune system is going to really get overactive, many times imbalanced, because we're in this constant lighter fluid fire going on. And it's really interesting to look at, yes, their immune system may be imbalanced or turned on. We need to connect the dots. What are those factors? What's going on in the gut? What are they eating? What is all of this going together? But a lot of these kids have this genetic predisposition. Maybe they are sensitive to glutamates. And when we have the glutamate storm in the brain, genetically, they may have more symptoms, more aggressive symptoms than somebody who doesn't have those genetics.
Oh, wow, that's so fascinating. Of course, I love talking about genetics. And I think we're discovering so much more, especially with our children growing up now, how much that our genetics are influenced, right? Not only by what we eat, how that microbiome is, how we have that, I love what you had to describe, that kind of like fire response, that flaming, because when we have that, sometimes it's hard for us to dive deep into what's going on. Because it was like, okay, like for someone with tic disorders or symptoms, like, how could that be connected to my genetics? And then when you explained it so perfectly, it's like we have things turned on or things turned off. And when it can make us more prone or more in a different disposition to have a different response. And such a great way you explained that.
Yeah, genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So we have to look at, okay, here's your blueprint, but what is that environmental epigenetic factors? What's going on in your environment, your house, your school, your diet, the things that you're eating, the amount of sleep you're getting? How does that all go?
It's all interconnected. And I love how you talked about that like little stress piece. So do you see that a lot with the children's and family that you work with, that there's some kind of stress factor in play, whether that's, of course, like you said, everybody's individualized, but I'm speaking more general, like maybe it's in their school environment or their home environment. And how do you work with those children and those families to help decrease that stress?
I look at stress in so many areas: environmental stressors, physical stressors, those underlying infection stressors, the biological stressors, those emotional stressors. So I do see a lot of kids who do experience emotional stressors. And part of that is they're experiencing these symptoms. They go to school, it's very stressful. They live in this constant state of fight or flight. So we do talk about how you can start to reduce some of those stressors. Of course, as we're changing diet and lifestyle, that starts to help. But also, kids, deep breathing, chewing your food, even taking some time to just go out on a walk and get away from the internet and the computer and the video games.
What's that about?
I know. It really is that holistic piece of diet, rest, exercise, stress reduction, supplementation. How do all of these things really go together? Yeah, I do see a lot of kids, a lot of families, mom and dad are super stressed. That bleeds over. Kids super stressed, that bleeds over. So definitely stress plays a big role as well.
Yeah, that's so key. And have you seen, since the pandemic, have you seen any shift in the patients that have been coming in, any change in your practice?
I've seen a lot of teenagers recently, but I will say that a lot of those teenagers, they've been dealing with it for years. And I think it's finally come to a head, and mom and dad are like, we need help. And what we're doing is not working. But definitely, when you read studies, when you see things on the internet, it's like there's been a huge increase in tics and tic disorders and PANS and PANDAS. But what I noticed is I didn't realize just in general how many families struggle with this, like thousands and thousands. And it's not something that's really talked about. There's not a lot of people who are helping to deal with it, especially in the alternative aspect. So it has been an interesting journey for sure.
Yeah. And do you think that, I think that mental health disorders, not that's the same exact thing as tic disorders, but I think that's in this category of shame that used to be. And now it's like moving it up into a place where a lot more people are talking about mental health conditions and knowing that they can reach out and get help. Do you think that's correlated to the way that families feel about getting help for their children? I can do this on my own. I can't reach out. Maybe I don't want to talk about it with my friends and family members.
That's definitely a piece of it. But I think we have so many parents who are best friends with Dr. Google. They're Googling everything. They're trying everything, and then they're shooting in the dark. And then they feel totally discouraged when none of that works, because they don't have the pieces of how long should I try a diet change? How long should I try a supplement? They don't have those tools and access because they are not readily available. And the mental health piece, the shame, there are some kids who don't want to talk about tics. And a lot of times parents will go to the doctor and they'll say, don't talk about them because it'll make it worse. And then these children are really confused. They're like, what is happening in my body? I don't understand why I cannot control these movements. So I'm completely the opposite. It is very important to talk to your child about what is going on in their body.
Yeah, because when they're in that fear state, it just puts them into that fight or flight mode more often. And then they're going to have most likely more responses to being in that environment, even that stress state. That is really key. I love that you mentioned that. And I think that if you're listening right now and tuning in and this is resonating with you, please seek out help. I think that's one thing I wanted to hit home on is that you seek out someone like Piper, who is an expert. Because, when you're shooting in the dark, don't use Dr. Google. You need to know, and like you were saying, Piper, the actual aspects of testing, all the different pieces that can see that much larger puzzle come into play. Super important to work with an expert who knows what to do.
For sure.
For sure. Okay, so we talked about some of the lab aspects. So what kind of lab testing do you do for genetics? Could you talk? I always like to talk about this because people are like, what is genetic testing? Well, am I going to have to give my life away? So I'd love for you to just walk through that so people can understand how easy it is and what the process is.
Yeah, it's really easy. My sister is a high school teacher, and she actually had me do this a couple times this week with her students. So,
oh, nice. That's great.
It's fresh. So there are several different types of genetic tests. You can get a serum, you can get a dry blood spot. I use a buccal swab. So it's like a giant Q-tip. You scrub the inside of your cheeks for cells and you pop it in the mail. And so what I'm looking at is single nucleotide polymorphism. So you're getting this little change in a base pair, like your computer code gets changed when your genetic code gets changed just a little bit. Right. Maybe those genes are not functioning in the same manner. And we can look at that and figure out how to give you optimal health based on those changes. So some people, genetic counselors might be looking at chromosome deletions and additions, where I'm looking at these little teeny minute changes within your genetics to really figure out what your blueprint is. I look at between 35 to 55 genes, depending on who I'm working with, but really looking at methylation, how well you're utilizing the folate and the B12. I look at how well you're creating neurotransmitters. I look at detoxification pathways, mitochondria, how well you're creating all the energy. Mm-hmm. I look at those inflammatory factors, those on and off switches for inflammation. And then environmental factors. What does your gut look like? Do you have histamine issues? Should you really be eating gluten and dairy or sugar? We can look at all of these things. And I think when you're able to look at that, it's like the big aha moment for parents. They're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense.
It gives them so much power because we're like, oh, this is so explainable. I love that about working with patients with genetics, is that like when they can see, oh, actually it's in my genes. That's why this is happening to me. It all makes sense when they've been having this almost like guilt factor. Oh, I feel so frustrated because I can't figure out what's going on. Like, but look, it's in your DNA. We can easily help you. Yeah. So it's like empowerment blueprint, which is just life-changing for patients and for families.
It really is. And I have all of my clients do it. And they're like, how come I can't go do 23andMe? And I'm like, 23andMe is a novelty test. It's really
that's old school too.
Yeah, it's old school. And I'm not looking at 12,000 pages of raw data. I love you, but yeah.
I know. Yeah. So that's a great point. So when you were mentioning that, you said around 35. Yeah. And so listeners, there's so much code in our data. And as practitioners, we don't look at all that code because it would be so overwhelming for us. Mm-hmm. And it's not all readily available. The science is not behind every single genetic SNP at this moment in time, but then we want to be specific. And I think that's what you're talking about too. It's just so important, Piper, that like, let's look at the things that are specific to what we know can help with your case specifically, with the brain function, the gut function, all those pathways with immunity and inflammation.
1 billion%.
1 billion%. I love it. Totally. Okay. So when you're looking at that genetic report from that nutrition perspective, you mentioned methylation with the MTHFR gene, so important. So what are some of those other nutritional aspects you're looking for with genes? I don't know, vitamin D. Are you looking for specific things on those reports that you would then recommend a supplement, for instance?
Yeah. So I like to say that MTHFR is the hot, sexy gene. It's like the gene it's the gene that everybody knows. You can absolutely like Dr. Google it, but I feel like there's a lot of actually incomplete information. It's not wrong. It's just incomplete. And so I look at the methylation pathway monogenically. Like I am looking at what is this whole enzyme pathway, because you can test one gene and maybe you don't have MTHFR, but you have methylation issues because you have an FOLR2 that is broken, or you've got a variant. So right. I do look at that whole pathway. I also look at things like VDR, your vitamin D receptor, your D binding protein. I look at, when I'm looking at neurotransmitters, we're going to look at things like GAD1. Do you have glutamate issues? We're going to look at COMT, but we want to look at it in a way that if you have a methylation issue and you're not utilizing that bioactive folate, but you also have a COMT and an MAOA and an MAOB,
Yep.
do you have enough folate in that pathway to make those neurotransmitters in the first place? So for me, it's really looking at that combination. And when we look at mitochondria, we're looking at, do you need magnesium? Do you need iron? What are you needing in this pathway to create more energy?
Right. Yeah. And that's so important because as you were talking with that gut brain connection. So we have all these different pathways in our brain that communicate with the gut. And if we're taking not the right supplement for us because we're not able to use it in a specific way, and then our gut is not able to absorb it properly, then it's like total communication breakdown.
Yeah, it really is. And that's where I think that incomplete information comes in, and where parents really get frustrated because they're like, my child has an MTHFR and we're doing this. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not looking at all of these other genes that are going to be impacted by all of these other things.
It's not just as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. It's a way more down the line or ahead of the line. Just like we have different amino acids in our body that are turned on by a specific methylation process. And we can't get from A to B if we don't have all of the aspects before that. And our body is simple, but yet complicated.
It really is. And I have a lot of parents that when you test MTHFR and maybe you start taking methylfolate, if you have a lot of inflammation in the body, your child might feel worse than they feel better. And you're really discouraged because you're like, well, they're taking the methylfolate, but it's not getting better. What is happening? And I'm like, because you haven't looked at these other factors. And so that was really where it's important to find somebody who knows how to look at it and knows how it applies to your case.
Yeah. And that's what you're like emphasizing too, that individuality with your patients, is because it's so true. When we have our own genetic blueprint, and we each need something specific to help us be the best that we can be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when we're talking about we mentioned a little bit about tic disorders and ADHD in general. I'd love for us to talk a little bit more about that behavioral pattern, or because I think that's a really challenging aspect for parents and their families. So if someone's listening, what kind of tips can you give them to help switch up that behavior pattern? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenging pieces, is more not just one thing, because we've been talking about a lot of things. Does it need to be that whole picture, or is there like a simple step that they could start doing? Like you mentioned, breathing.
Yeah. So there was a really great study that just came out this week about mood disorders and inflammation, and how they are hand in hand besties, how they go together.
Yeah.
And when I'm looking at what families are dealing with, one of the best things you can do is look at your diet. How much added sugar, how much packaged processed foods are you eating? Like we don't really understand how much trash food we're eating. And so for parents, I'm like, if you have a child who's having some mood issues, I call it like the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde meltdown, the ADHD, they cannot focus. It's really important to start by looking at what's going on in the diet. How much of that packaged, processed, bagged, bottled food can you get rid of? You as the parent, if your kid can't drive, you have ultimate cosmic power. You can say, I'm not buying that. We're not having it in the house, so therefore you cannot eat it. So really looking at how you make those changes, getting rid of that additional sugar. The USDA says kids shouldn't have more than 13 grams of added sugar in a day. And that's a teaspoon. If your kid drinks a Coke, it's 3 or 4 days worth of added sugar. Your kid eats a Go-Gurt, that's half of your added sugar for the day.
Yeah. And I think that's great. I love that you talked about nutrition, because that's so important when it comes to how we function with mood. And like you said, I love that new study. I can't wait to check it out. There's a lot of studies that have been done that connect the gut and the mood and what we eat. And I love that sugar component, because a lot of patients I find don't even know how to read a label. They're not reading it at all when it comes to their family, and they're letting their kids, like you said, be in the driver's seat, have a tantrum in the grocery store because they're not going to be able to have that box of cereal, and or maybe the adult is having the tantrum. Who knows which one? But yeah, and when they're in that nutritional piece, how do you work with helping them? I think you said like going through the cabinets. Are there specific like meal plans that you help guide them on, that you have, hey, this is it. Some people don't even know where to start. I think that can be frustrating. How to shop, how to make a meal plan. Do you work with patients with that?
Yes. So part of working with me is we are going to give you recipe guides, meal plans. I'm going to share my favorite cookbooks with you, but I actually have an amazing family health educator. So once we know what changes you need to make, I'm going to pass you off to Danielle, and she's going to work with you to figure out, okay, what are your child's top 3 favorite recipes? So we know they shouldn't have gluten or dairy, but their favorite recipes are pizza and spaghetti. And how do we create 3 easy recipe swaps for you so that you can have that? Or maybe you're a mom who's super busy, you don't have time to cook. We're going to give you super easy recipes like sheet pan, pick a veggie, pick protein, pick carbs. So like green beans, potatoes, and chicken. Put it on your sheet pan, season it up. Here's your simple, easy dinner. Not processed, not packaged, not rice-a-roni.
Right, rice-a-roni. Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's really important. And I like how you had that component coming in too, because as practitioners, we can't do everything ourselves. We have to refer out, and so we can have that team help you. And that's so key. I love that you brought that up, because especially when it comes to nutrition, is huge when it comes to families and how they eat. I know that a lot of people feel overwhelmed, especially as you mentioned, if you're a busy parent and you're working a lot, like how do you even plan out what to eat for yourself, much less for the kid? And my friend was talking to me about this recently, and she was saying like, no matter what she makes, her child didn't want to eat it. And how do you work with that with patients when they're switching in from that? Okay, here's your new dietary plan. Oh no, I'm only going to eat pizza, chicken. And like you mentioned that, but what is that? So you're working with the behavioral problem or issue, so to speak. And then maybe it's a lot around food. How do you address those food issues?
Gateway flavors. So you have gateway drugs, we have gateway flavors.
Gateway flavors.
So think about why your child likes a certain food. So yes, they love pizza. Is it the tomato sauce? Is it the cheese because it's savory? Is it the pepperoni? What is it about? Is it the garlic? What is it about the pizza that's so good and what they want to eat? And then you can use those flavors. So if it's the garlic, it's okay. How can we take this garlic flavor and put it into other recipes? You put bacon grease and garlic all over your roasted broccoli, or use the garlic to make garlic mashed potatoes. How can you take these gateway flavors and include them in this new process of foods that you are feeding your child? So it's a matter of figuring out what it is they like about a particular food and then using those pieces.
That's great, Piper. I love that hashtag gateway flavors. That's yeah, so important, because I think that's really key to, and you're talking about eliminating sugar, and that's a huge component when it comes to our problem with so many health problems with children. And when we're talking about eliminating sugar, those cells are going to be like, what have you done to me? Especially if they're drinking like Coke or the Starbucks with all the caffeine. So there has to be this, like, there's a withdrawal stage for the cells. And then we have to figure out a way to give them a quote unquote substitution that they're going to be like, okay with.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the sugar replacements? Do you say, okay, you got to cut out sugar altogether? Or do you give your patients like a list, like, okay, like honey is okay, dates, maple syrup? Are there some sugar alternatives that you usually use?
I like honey in moderation. There are some really good studies that honey is not really raising blood sugar. So honey in moderation. I'm not like put 40 tablespoons of honey on your cornflakes or whatever. I like stevia. I like monk fruit. I think those are good options. Dates are good depending on what we're using it in. So again, it's about moderation, because we have this sweet craving. We want this sweet, which it's really our gut microbiome that's, please feed me this sugar. So we really want to consider that, yes, like sweet is a great flavor, but we also want to use it in moderation. It's too much of a good thing can be a bad thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it made me think about how popular the gummies are for kids, those gummy supplements. How do you feel about those?
If we were friends on Facebook, you could have seen my post last week. It was about I saw this ad for these new vitamins that are vitamins, but they're jelly beans. And so I was like, okay, I got to look at the label on this one.
Right.
And my post was, these are jelly beans masquerading as vitamins, but they're really jelly beans. There's sugar, there's corn syrup, and the vitamins that were in there were synthetic. Your body has to do extra work to process them if you can process them in the first place. And so I'm not a huge gummy fan. If I have a child that I'm working with who they don't swallow pills, we might look for liquid options or a patch or a sublingual, something else, a powder, something else that's really going to get them the right nutrition. To me, it's a jelly bean masquerading as a vitamin, and it's a jelly bean.
That's so true. I love that. And I think we're also feeding them the wrong information because they're like, okay, yeah, we're telling you not to eat candy and sugar, but here we're going to give you this candy or sugar anyway. Yeah. Sometimes I'll work with patients to make their own gummies because you can use like healthy alternatives. And then you're like my stepdad, for instance, not that he's my child, my stepdad, for instance, he eats Jello as a way, he uses natural sweetener and then as a way to get his collagen for his bones. And so we can make like a healthy, sweet alternative, but I think that message has to be clear to the kids too. It's where this is something healthy for you, not loaded with sugar.
I agree 1000%. And that's part of the process. When my son was diagnosed, we searched and searched. No, there wasn't a lot of help, that we were just told to ignore it. And then we found a great alternative allergist who was, I think you should go to a nutritionist. We had one nutritionist in town. She was backed up for 6 months. So here I am going, what am I going to do? I have to figure this out myself. And I think that's part of it for parents is they need somebody to hold their hand and give them that direction. And Dr. Google is not always the best hand holder.
No, there's too much information out there now, I think, and it's very diluted, especially when it comes to genetics. Like you mentioned, that information is just all over the board. And so you really need to be working with someone who's knowledgeable. And that nutrition piece, like you mentioned, is so important for that gut microbiome and that gut brain communication. And we want to have it be like working 100%, not just like half turned on.
Exactly.
And okay, so we're looking at that genetic piece. We're looking at the nutrition piece. We're looking at the whole foundations. So I think that's a great summary of what your treatment plan looks like. So can you explain, say someone comes in, I just like for the listeners to see the process. So they're coming in and you're doing a little bit of that testing, you figure out what's going on. So walk us through like the phases like X, Y, Z.
Yeah. So someone comes to me, they're like, I want to work with you. I want to be a client. So we get them set up. We get the kits shipped out. And the first few weeks is a waiting. You're waiting for the kits and then you're waiting for the test results. And so I actually have it set up so that every single week, my clients are getting an email. The first week is, here's the forms you need to fill out. Here's how you track your diet. And then we start to look at things like nutrition and nutritional deficiencies. They get a video. They get how to start cutting out sugar, how to revamp and give your pantry and your kitchen a facelift. And so they're getting all of these tips and tools and micro size bites to get them started. But once we have that data, that information, we're going to spend about an hour and a half going over everything. So it's a Zoom call, we record it, and then I put together a plan for them. So what does it look like for your child? So it's not always the same for every child. It's very different. And so for some kids, we're going to spend 60 to 90 days working on the gut. And in that piece, we're going to start taking away certain foods. And then after that, we'll start working on nutrition based on genetics, because if your gut's a wreck, you could take a whole ton of supplements, but you may not be absorbing them. So let's get the gut back in shape. So we're really going to work in phases. I work very slowly because I know that these children are extremely sensitive. And if we just start throwing everything in the kitchen sink, it's going to get worse. You're not going to be happy. So it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It is slow. We're working for 3 to 6 months on getting all these things balanced and getting your child back on track.
I love that. I love the aspect of how you laid it out and also that slowness, because I think, when we throw a bunch of things out at our patients in general, they feel overwhelmed. They're like, what do I do now? And they got to have the step-by-step process, because then it also allows them to see improvement. You're like, when I went from, okay, I did first week, I already saw some improvement. It's from eliminating sugar, So I think it does open their eyes, and that slow process allows them to have those tools that are really start to embed at a deeper level. level instead of just be like, oh, here you go, run down the road and see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And it's part of that hand holding piece because they're already overwhelmed and they've already feel like they've tried everything on the internet.
Right.
And so they need those clear steps and clear timeframes for this is really how you have to do it. I had a mom say, if I work with you and I don't see changes in 2 months, can I get my money back? And I said, no, here's why.
Right.
There's an accountability piece because sometimes you're starting to see little changes. My kid's sleeping better, they're pooping better, their moods are better, but maybe their tics haven't gotten a bazillion % better. I have a client that by 4 months, her daughter was completely tick free. So if she had stepped out at month 2, she would have been disappointed, but she got to month 4 and now she works for me. But now her daughter is tick free at this point. It's really about having that step-by-step process, that hand holding and that plan to get you where you need to be.
Yeah. And I really like what you said about being committed and not like dropping out in the beginning, because our body needs to have, it takes time. It takes time for that healing to take place. Now, children are very resilient, but like you said, they are also, what's the word? I lost it in my mind. When they have too many things thrown at them at once, they can have more of a reaction. It can send us into that snowball. Yeah. I like that you said that, slow and easy, giving them the pieces and being committed, seeing how the results. And that's true with everyone, not just with children, but with any person taking on a new health routine. You have to take it slow. And so you can see those results. Some people don't want to wait though.
They really don't. They really don't. We are, instant gratification these days and they don't. And I was telling my Facebook group the other day, like probiotics are great, but if you have a child that has these symptoms and they're really sensitive and you're taking probiotic that you got at the grocery store, you might be pushing your child's gut in the wrong direction. It may not be exactly what they need. And so when we're looking and getting that data, we can say, okay, here's what you need. And this is how you do it, because just putting it in might make it worse before it gets better. If it gets better, because you don't have that step.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too. I think that's important about working with a health practitioner is that when you see that problem happening, oh, maybe you were taking a specific probiotic and then you have this result, you can easily work with the practitioner to, oh, we need to change things up. This isn't working. Instead of you shooting at the dark, like you said, using Google as your doctor.
Yep. I see it all the time. All the time.
Yeah, I know. Me too.
I'm sure you do too.
Oh yeah. The people, my patients will send me things that they found on the internet. And I'm like, okay, wait, take a step back. Let me help you, guide you on the right steps. Please don't just start taking things willy nilly.
All the time.
Right. Because then we don't have a control model, so to speak, when things are going in that we aren't aware of.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Let's switch topics and talk about your book, which is super exciting. Yeah. Yay. So your book is coming out like tomorrow. And can you tell us, the name is Corporate Dropouts and you're a co-author in the book. Tell us about the book. What is it about and how did it come to play?
So it is a book, a multi-author book. There's 20 of us, and it's really about women who left the corporate world to become entrepreneurs. And we all share our stories about how we got there, and they are all very different. My story is called From Jeans to Jeans, and it's about how I started out in the fashion industry working for a denim company and how I went from working with those jeans to your genetic genes.
Yeah.
And it is my first foray into being an author. I actually just sent my publisher a copy of my tick disorder book to start looking at, but I'm really excited to get this out there because I think a lot of parents don't have the guts to take the leap to really follow their passions. So it's really about how all of these women are following their passions in different areas of life.
That's great. And it's all women in the book?
It is all women. And
that's so cool. I can't wait to get a copy. I love that because so many of us are, especially with the pandemic, have really taken a deeper look at how we were working in the world. Was it serving us? Were we being called to do our passion? How could we change what we're doing? And I think a lot of people that were working in that corporate model were like, oh, this is not working for me, but now what do I do?
Yeah.
And so we've seen so many people take on an entrepreneurship, becoming their own business owner or joining forces with another woman in the force field, just like really changing things to make a difference.
Yeah, and the stories are so different. Mine was like, the universe was like, this is what you'll do. And so now here I am. When it all started, it wasn't it was 1000% to help my son. How can I help my son? But then we started seeing big changes. People started reaching out to help me. And at that point, this is what you'll do. I was like, okay, here we
Like,
go.
okay, here we go.
We're going.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting how we get driven down a path that we had never even thought would be possible or come into our circumstances before that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I can't wait to get a copy of the book, and we'll share all that in the show notes so people can find it and the links. And then as we're wrapping up things today, Piper, I'd love for you to just give one last thing, one question here for you. If you had an unlimited budget right now, what would you do to make the biggest impact on the planet?
I had an unlimited budget. I would really work to educate and get all of this information out about what's really going on. I would fund my own studies to talk about how diet and nutrition are so extremely important, or how genetics and gut are impacting this, because the information's not out there. And so if I had an unlimited budget, I would be getting really nerdy and really sciencey and studying all these things so that I could educate all of these parents on, here is where tics are not necessarily purely neurological. We have to look beyond the brain.
Oh, that's great. Ding, you got that one. That's amazing, because I think the more knowledge that we empower people with, the more we have a change on the planet, right? And more with especially our children growing up today, we want to give them the best environment. And when we're searching out things that we don't know about, where's the information? So that's great. Tell us how we can find you, follow you, learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's several ways. So my website is www.regenerating.health. I've got some great freebies. I've got that blog. You can definitely check out the blog. And then you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Regenerating Health. And then I also have a private Facebook group called Tic Disorder Parent Support Group. Just pop it in the chat, almost 1,000 members, but really talking about these alternative approaches and ideas for our child's tics, Tourette's, PANS, PANDAS, OCD, ASD, all of those.
Yes, that's great. And I don't think I have that Facebook group, so I'll make sure I put that in the show notes for everybody. And then the freebie, I think you did give me, can you tell me about the freebie? Because we do have that we can give out the link for.
So it is the Tic Disorders cheat sheet. And it's about 9 pages of information on why we're looking at tics in a different manner. Like, tics are your check engine light. You need to get to the mechanic. And then we're going to look at some simple steps to get you started on maybe making some diet changes, how to do that. So it is just your beginner step guide. It is not the be all end all directional approach, but definitely a lot of information if you feel like you're struggling and lost and you need some information.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in there so people can start on the right path, learning about how to take charge of their health and their family's health, and then reaching out to you for more in-depth help. So thank you, Piper, for joining us today. I loved our conversation, and I can't wait to share it with the world.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.